So, welcome to our guest for this evening, Graham Chalmers, and my co-host. I'm Charles Hutchinson. This is Two Big Egos in a Small Car, and we're squeezing into the car tonight. Grant McPhee, writer and filmmaker, and we're looking at the latest thing that Grant has put together, which is for the Cherry Red Records, the 3 CD box set, loosely described as the history of Scottish indie pop. And Grant, you can actually give the full and correct title, if you would.
Something for the long end. Scottish independent pop, 1985 to 1999. I had to look down just so I could remember it. But I think the subtitle should be Another Story of Scottish Pop, because it can get quite contentious, because we put together a 5 CD box set
Yes.
a few years ago called Big Gold Dreams. So this is a
Yes.
companion to it. And
Film
it,
as well.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you spend a couple of minutes on the internet looking at, even vaguely sort of discussing this, as soon as you say something's like definitive, you'll have hundreds of people complaining why their favorite bands are not put on there. And so the mistake should have been another story. So it's not the story, but it is a story of Scottish.
It's
And
reminding me of the Waterboys finding endless versions of Fisherman's Blues to add yet another. Having done a 5 CD extra disc or discs already, they've just announced this new album where Mike Scott has decided to add yet another release about it. I mean, I would have thought actually Scottish indie. I mean, it's kind of again another endless resource, if you like. And it must have been a joy actually to. I mean, there are familiar names on there as well, but there are some, of course, that would, I guess, be considered more obscure. How much was it that it was research that was needed, or how much did actually people come forward, as you say, and say, "Look, you haven't featured this band. I really think that they are worthy of, being featured in the history of Scottish indie over that period."
well, what was different about this one compared with the earlier Cherry Red CD was the time frame. So this goes up to 1999, and the earlier one was up to 1989, and we have like a whole new breed of Scottish indie superstars at our disposal. And this came about because you kindly covered my earlier book, Postcards from Scotland, which covered the, for want of a better word, and there should be a better word, the C86 period
Yes.
in Scottish, sort of the 80s jangly history. And I'd when I was writing that, I'd like written a companion to it, so it wasn't really a sequel or a follow up. It was almost like what's the term? I suppose it would be what's the joinery term for like interlinking? So a dovetail and joint. So the interesting thing for me while I was researching the second book was that we refer to like the C86 compilation as being this sort of jingly, jangly 60s like West Coast birds inspired type of music. And it's really not when you actually look at it. And I'd heard it lots of times, and it wasn't really until one of the members of the bands that I've spoken to recently touched upon it. He said that it's two different genres of music. You have the jangly aspect, like Primal Scream, and then you have the sort of like much harder, discordant type of music, which like harks back to like sort of Beefheart and Joseph K and the Fire Engines. So the idea of the second book, which is called Scene Within a Scene, it is this scene within a scene. So it traces the history of the other bands which are inspired by the C86, the other side of the C86 cassette. And for me, that brought up a whole host of like bands I hadn't really encountered before. And while the 90s Glasgow indie bands like Bell and Sebastian, Mogwai, Arab Sarp are really sort of quite familiar with people. There's a whole lineage that goes back from that scene to the early 80s, and that's what really interested me in compiling this compilation and the two books, in that there's almost like a forgotten scene of Scottish like indie acts like from the 80s, and I really wanted like to cover those bands, but also, reinforce this aspect that the bands, which are just like covered, like Mogwai, Arab Strap, don't really have that sort of lineage back to bands like BMX Bandits and Soup Dragons. It comes from another place, and that's like bands like Dawson and Stretch Heads and all these like fantastic, Badger, all these like amazing bands that came out of Scotland in the sort of mid to late 80s, which were just not really, haven't been compiled or covered. So a lot of these bands, we contacted people like from Bosk Records, which are a fantastic Edinburgh label, and a lot of this stuff hasn't ever appeared on CD. So that was like the rambling sort of version of it, in that there was this like hidden history which wanted to get across, which had like a different lineage, and importantly it's another story, not like the story, but in a lot of ways this is, I think, ironically sort of more definitive, in that it touches upon those bands, but obviously you can never cover every single band that ever existed. You'd need like thousands of CDs.
Graham.
The great thing about your books, Grant, and the Cherry Reds box set is you show that the bands who did make it, like Jesus and Mary Chain or even Shop Assistants, they were just the tip of the iceberg. They weren't the scene. There was a whole ecosystem of labels and bands and venues and promoters around them, and they just happened to be the ones who made it big. But all the rest of the bands were equally interesting bands. And the 6, 7 tracks on the Something for the Longing box set, and I've never heard like half them before. And it's an absolute treasure trove of stuff that's obscure and rare, but it's definitely worth hearing. So I've got about top five. I've got a top 5 favorite tracks from this whole box set.
Well,
I
I'd
was
love
wondering
to
if you
know
have
those.
any favorite ones, Grant. Any sort of rare gems that are you're particularly pleased to have got on the
Well, I'd love
album?
to know your favorites first, Graham.
Well, I love the Orchids' Something for the Longing,
Oh yeah,
which came out in Sarah Records, a band from Glasgow in 1990. And I love it because they sound like a better version of the Go-Betweens with more emotion. It's such a brilliant track by the Orchids.
yeah, fantastic track, absolutely.
I also like BMX Bandits, Serious Drugs, Creation Records 1992.
Yeah,
That sounds like a spray from Bell's Hill. That sounds like a slacker version of the Verve before the Verve even existed.
yeah,
And it's just a brilliant, that could have been a hit single if it'd been on a big label. I also
absolutely,
like The
absolutely.
Motorcycle Boy, which Big Rock Candy Mountain, Rough Trade 1987 with the former shop assistant singer Alex Taylor lead vocals from Edinburgh. And it's really exciting, big, chunky pop rock. It's so American. It sounds like if Laura Branigan had been punked up, she would have done that track. It would have been a hit in America if it had been on a big label. Again, all these things would have been hits if they'd had like the infrastructure behind them, I think.
Yeah,
Also,
absolutely.
obviously the Vaselines are obvious. Teenage Superstars, 1989 on 53rd and 3rd. Just great track. And I particularly like the Starlets Tainted on Flotsam and Jetsam from 1997. It's such a brilliant pop song. It's sort of like bright, sunny 60s chamber pop. And it's as catchy as The Beautiful South. And when I heard it, I thought, why wasn't this a hit? It's such a great song.
No, absolutely. And I think, Flotsam and Jetsam are, such an interesting label. And, you know, I think you've like hit upon, the sort of like diversity of this. I think if you said to like a journalist, can you define like Scottish indie, they'd maybe, mention like the Vaselines or, Orange Juice, and, one of the very sort of, the well-known bands like Jesus and Mary Chain or Teenage Fan Club. And to me, I also wanted to get this diversity across that, these bands are all working and operating under the same DNA, under this sort of umbrella of like indie pop. But indie pop to me is such a vast soundscape of, different meanings of what pop is, from like traditional, you say like chamber pop, and something that harks back to the Beatles, but it can be like so much more. And that's the beauty of what Scotland was doing in this period. It was just like such a huge, diverse form of music operating under this umbrella. And for one of the books, I interviewed Alex Kapranos from Franz Ferdinand, obviously a huge band in the next iteration of like Scottish indie pop, and he ran a club which is like almost like the sort of the locus, the focal point of like many of these bands, especially in the very early 90s, 30s, not along with R.M. Hubert. And what their sort of like creed was that you can play here, but you have to be different. You have to be doing something that is different and trying something new. Don't want people who just copy what's already been done. And I think that is such an important part of this story. And like Flotsam and Jetsam, which was like co-run by R.M. Hubert, it was two of the biggest labels in that period was like Chemical Underground, and obviously they're so huge and such clever people who can take these bands to the next level. But like Flotsam and Jetsam were taking all the bands who maybe didn't have that same business acumen, and it was just such I suppose almost like a sort of socialist like aspect of doing something for the benefit of the overall good, and like allowing these bands to like release a record, and not having a defined sound which like most labels do. And that's why you get like bands like Starlights mixed up with like Nostril, and just like such a sort of potpourri of like different types of music, but all sharing, as I said before, this like same DNA.
It can't be as simple as whether John Peel played a song or not, can it?
No, but what is interesting to me from both of these periods, the sort of the 80s indie scene and 90s indie scene, because a lot of this is like projection for me, because I'd love to have been in a band and part of this scene. And to me, one of the sort of like glorious artifacts of pop would be like a 7-inch single. So one of the questions I always ask people is, how did it feel to have your first single released and you're holding it in your hand? And almost everybody said that other than it being like great, it wasn't as good as when John Peel played it on the radio.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's just amazing, like his not only sort of like influence, but um his sort of patronage on um
Mm.
a band. It's just like you're being like blessed by John Peel, but also this was like excuse me, Radio One, albeit
Mm.
late at night. But this was going out to a lot of people, so
Yes.
that could make a huge difference, and
Mm.
probably more so than Melody Maker and NME reviews of the
Mm.
time. Having John Peel blessing your record,
Mm.
it's so I don't think it's a case of you're right in that it's not just something that John Peel would play, but like John Peel's um shadow is over almost everything. And
Mm.
you will have like bands who'd be like reactionary
Mm.
towards that. But I think secretly every single person would want John Peel to
Yeah.
play their single, and I think that's something that is probably part of like what fits very well with the CD, and it's
Mm.
the sort of diversity of it. And he was so well regarded and known for like the diversity of like his shows.
Was there a Scottish radio equivalent of John Peel, highlighting some of the bands that maybe John didn't actually get to play?
Well, it's quite a hot topic at the moment. I
Mm.
don't know if it has reached you with BBC Scotland and their, I think, disregard for um, what has made Scottish music so widely regarded
Mm.
around the world is
Mm.
that you know it's just an insane form of cultural vandalism, you know, like getting rid of like some of the majority of the presenters who would play music
Yeah.
like this. And, you know, but back in the day, as in, you know, when this form of music first started becoming popular in the late 70s with in the rise of like independent and DIY record labels,
Mm.
wasn't really much of an outlet in Scotland for that. There was a radio station on Radio Clyde, and it was called Street Sounds,
Mhm.
and you know they played part of that. But it wasn't until you know the mid '70s when Scotland actually had its own radio stations. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of Radio 4 would become BBC Scotland. You know, it was like shared sort of like broadcasting hours, and you know I'm not entirely sure of the exact sort of like chronology of when independent radio stations started forming, but I don't think there was that much at
Mm.
that time. You know, certainly there was in you know the next decade, you know, the sort of golden years of like independent radio, but there wasn't really much for that. You know, we've got some great people still like Vic Galloway, who has
Mhm.
a really important show, but at that time,
Mhm.
I don't think there really was that much, and it was the traditional formula of like where you would get your information about independent bands, like
Yeah.
fanzines, obviously hugely important,
Yes.
and the weekly music press. But like John Peel really was
Yeah.
the main outlet for this.
Yeah. Graham.
When I go through the three CDs on the box set, the music changes each decade, each era. But there's a feeling I get from listening to all those diverse tracks from different years. And it's the same feeling I get by reading your books like Postcards from Scotland, which I think is now out on paperback on Omnibus Press. It's an honesty, which I think is partly a Scottish characteristic, and lack of pretension, even when being experimental. But I think it's more than that. The independence is true independence. When these labels were being formed in Glasgow, Edinburgh in particular, it wasn't as a gesture or some sort of pose. It's because there was no industry in Scotland they could possibly fit into. Whereas bands in England know they can go to London or they can go somewhere else, and there's proper infrastructure, there's proper big money around. In Scotland, you have to be independent because there's no alternative. So therefore, it's entirely genuine. It's
Mm.
genuinely independent, and I think that's what Kurt Cobain saw in the Vaselines. This wasn't a pretense. They weren't just trying to look cool for the newspapers or get on TV. This was the real deal.
Mm.
No, I think you're absolutely right. A book that I've been working on and put out last year was about Scotland's very early punk years, 1976, 1977. And, you know, I always thought it was really odd that, you know, Scotland had like quite an interesting and historic and important part of the 1960s counterculture in London with, you know,
Mm.
International Times, with, you know, the original editors being from Scotland and the co-founders being from
Jim
Edinburgh.
Haynes, November
Exactly, yeah,
Festival,
yeah,
the Fringe. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Mm.
you know, a fascinating character. And so Tom McGrath, the playwright, he was like the founding editor. And, you know, by rights, Scotland punk scene should have been very similar to what was happening in like London's. You know, a lot of the people, like Malcolm McLaren, you know, they have that art school sort of background, you know, and a lot of which came out of the counterculture. And that didn't exist in Scotland at all. And when I looked into this, you know, the main sort of story that you know we're presented with, the narrative, as it were, was that you know punk was just like banned in Scotland, but really it was because exactly as you say, there was like no infrastructure at all, and you know bands like Sensational Alex Harvey band, you know, well they could to an extent operate out of Scotland, they had to go down to London. You basic rollers, Slick, they had an element of being able to operate out of Edinburgh and Glasgow, but really they had to move down to London. And it wasn't really until punk happened in that year, that sort of cliched phrase that's used in every single music documentary, that um, things began to change. And it wasn't from a pre-existing industry. It wasn't like in London where all these like indies and punk bands like came out and sort of like changed how the music industry operated, because Scotland didn't have a music industry, and all of these people had to literally form their own independent labels. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Scotland had very, very little to offer the UK and the rest of the world in terms of like punk in 1977, but in January 1978 is when post-punk began. That was when the first Fast Product single came out, and it's when Simple Minds had their first gig, and Scotland, punched well above, their ability, not ability in terms of
Resources.
in resources. Yeah, exactly. Into pushing post punk, which in with Fire Engines, Fast Product, Scars, Orange Juice, Postcard records, all that came out from the work that these people did. And by people, I mean kids, like youngsters who were in these 1977 bands, and they literally had to like start up their own recording studios, rehearsal spaces, fight for opportunities to perform gigs and start up their record labels. They weren't breaking something that was there before. They were having to form their own infrastructure. And I think that's something that is in the seeds and DNA of everything in Scotland that came after. And I think that's why Scotland is regarded so highly in, inverted commas, like, indie music, because they had to, by like nature, virtue of like not having an industry, be independent. DIY is something Scotland had to do because it's all they could do. And I think from in every like scene, you always have like sort of like elders who will sort of like help the people who are just like up and coming bands. And I think from that moment in 1976 and 77, it's just something that's like filtered down to everybody, that doing something yourself and independently and against the grain, as it were. And I think in the 1990s, to me, I find that quite fascinating when Britpop became, and I got like wrapped up in Britpop as well. There's some like fantastic singles, but what it was something that was like looking back on a very Kinks, Small Faces, small swinging London sort of like facet of what pop music was. And I think in the very early days when Britpop happened, you had very interesting bands like Denim, who I think it didn't happen for them because the past which they were looking at was like from something outside of that sort of classic mid 60s pop. And for the Scottish bands, I don't think there was anything, anti London. I don't remember any sort of like stance that people had other than the usual just oh, we don't need to go down to London. I think it was just genuinely because there was no interest in looking back on the past, and it was like this DNA, which is a term I keep on using, like which had arrived in Scotland, like from having to start your own independent labels that and move forward. There was always this progression of doesn't matter if something isn't that good as long as it's moving forward and doing something differently. And I think that's why Britpop didn't happen. And I think it's something, as you said, Graham, it's just like apparent in all those CDs. It's just something that is very Scottish. And I think it came from that was what Scotland, what punk offered, like Scotland, a literal means of doing it yourself. And it's something I don't think it'll ever change. I think it's a really positive and healthy thing that you're always looking forward, and you don't need to rely on the past. Obviously, everyone takes that
If
influences from the past.
if DIY is in the DNA of Scottish bands to
Mm.
this day, it explains why great Scottish bands like Bell and Sebastian, Teenage Fan Club, the Beta Band either never joined a major label, or if they did, they didn't feel happy being there. There's something about the Scots that resists being part of that whole big time industry.
Yeah, I think there's I can't remember their quotes directly, but the two of the bands you mentioned there, Teenage Fan Club and Bell and Sebastian, I remember Stuart saying something, Stuart Murdoch from Bell and Sebastian saying something. It was almost as if after Tiger Milk, they were being like chased by every sort of major
Mm.
label, and he went with an independent label because he said, we're just not going to listen to. There's no point trying to sign us. We're not going to listen to anything you're going to tell us to do, and only an independent label would be able to allow them to do that. And Raymond McGinley from Teenage Fan Club said something very similar
Mm.
in that they just nod their head and smile politely when anyone asks them what they want to do, and they just go away and do what they want to do themselves. And the Beta Band again, have that. It's not an arrogance. It's just something that's this is, we know what we want to do, and we're going to do it. And I think that's such an important part of like great pop music, in that you have to be self-assured and know what you do and have this plan and just go forward with it.
That would apply with Arab Strap as well, of course.
Yeah,
It really would.
absolutely.
I mean, they're a very good example of that.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And
Well,
another
yeah.
great band, they're just resolute, and they are self-assured isn't, I don't think, the right term. It's just like they just know what they want to do. And I think that's like fascinating and
Mm.
fantastic.
I mean, you
They're
can get
confident.
bands like Simple Minds. Go on, Graham. Go on.
Mm.
Go on,
They
Graham.
were quite hard work when I interviewed them in about '98 at Just Well in Leeds. They were they weren't going to like suffer fools, that's for sure. And also, when they did like their first track on Camelgunga in 1996,
Mm.
I remember at the time thinking, this is a bit weird. This guy's talking, he's not singing. But it turns out Aidan Moffat actually invented spoken word
Yeah.
in music, really. And I didn't even think about that at the time, but that's revolutionary, Arab Strap.
Mm.
I think so. And it's just such a that single, First Great Weekend, or Last Great Weekend, it's just so unlike anything else at that time. It is unique, and you're right. I think people will have like heard that because it's a fantastic single, and just thought,
Mm.
well,
Mm,
this is amazing. I can't think of many examples of anything like that being done before. There's
I
no
can.
distance to that.
Grant, where would Scottish indie be right now in 2026?
See, Charles, I'm an old man now. I struggle to like think of, was that where it should be, or where do you think it
Where
is?
where where is it now? Because I mean, obviously, I love going back and looking back to what's featured on this triple CD, but tradition is that Scotland has has an independent scene, and I'm just wondering where that might be now. It's interesting, as you mentioned, about obviously there's now going to be more limited opportunity with
Yeah,
radio, with the BBC's policy. We know that venues struggle more than they used to give bands an opportunity to perform. There's lots of things that seem to me to make it more difficult, but the nature of being independent is finding a bloody way to do something.
absolutely. And I think in Glasgow, especially, there's like a fantastic scene, and there's so many supportive venues, which is great. I think Edinburgh less so.
Mm.
Um, my knowledge of new music, I would not, I'd be sort of unable to sort of like, but I'm old. I just can't sort of do that. But I think what is exciting is that all times of, great new scenes and great sort of forms of like music happening. It's like through times of when cost of living is like difficult for people, and when music gets difficult to find an outlet. And sort of in this CD, the second part in the 90s, in the 80s, there was a distribution network called the Cartel, which pretty much helped get every single independent single into the shops before 1990, and they went bust. And after that, it was like a huge tragedy, and things did slow down for a while. But as you said, people find a way, and the ingenuity of young people, I think, is boundless. And to me, that's excitement that something interesting will happen. And in Scotland itself, the fact that the BBC are really pushing away from homegrown music appearing on their on the biggest outlet for an artist, it's like it will decimate creativity, because bands have, back in the 80s and the 90s, you'd have like deals with even independent labels, which would give you like a small wage to survive on, or you'd have benefits which would help artists be able to like survive. And all of that's been like taken away, and I think it has become an industry to a large extent where it's only people with parents or backgrounds will allow them to be able to play, and that's not conducive to good music. And I think technology, with the advent of AI, is something which is like hugely going to change things. And I think any major label, like any major like film studio that like says for a second that we're going to fight against this, they're all lying. They will use whatever means to like lower costs, and it's like the bottom line which is like the king for them. But I think, as I said, young people have proven over the last like 70 years that they are the ones that will determine what type of music is like made, and labels will react to that. So I think I don't know how things will pan out over the next 1 or 2 years, but I'm very, very sort of positive that great music is going to come out of it, and especially in Scotland, because of that DNA that existed 50, it was created 50 years ago, is something that's going to seep through to everything. So I'm positive in the long term, but less so in the short term.
It's a brilliant compilation. It's something for the longing. But I'm interested, when is Seen Within a Scene, Scottish Independent Music 1992 to 2001? When's that coming out, Grant?
I believe it is the 6th of August 2026.
Excellent.
Very soon.
Brilliant. I'm looking forward to that so much, because Postcards from Scotland was fantastic, and I'm sure this will be equally good.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Grant, for joining us. Much appreciated. Thank you so much
Thank
for your
you
time.
both. Appreciate
Absolutely
it.
brilliant.
You've been listening to the podcast Two Big Egos in a Small Car. Your hosts were Graham Chalmers and Charles Hutchinson. This was a Baltic Sub production.